My name is Claire, and I still remember the sound before the pain. It was the shattering crack of a glass bottle colliding with the side of my face, a hollow echo that seemed to vibrate through the walls of my parents' dining room. The bottle slipped from my husband's hand after impact and smashed across the hardwood floor, amber liquid spreading like a stain that could never be scrubbed out. My cheek burned hot, then instantly cold blood trickling down past my jawline and dripping onto my blouse. The taste of alcohol mixed with iron filled my mouth. For a second, my ears rang so loudly I thought maybe the world had gone silent, but then I heard it. Laughter. Not from him alone, though his chuckle was sharp and smug as he wiped his hand against his pants, but from my parents seated not 3 feet away. My mother pressed her napkin daintily to her lips as if she were stifling a cough, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her. My father's eyes flicked over my wound and then back to his plate of roasted chicken. He chuckled low, shaking his head like an old man watching a child stumble and insisting it built character. I felt the sting of betrayal more than the sting in my face. I wanted to scream, to shout that their silence was louder than the blow itself, but my throat locked tight. My husband leaned back in his chair, poured another finger of bourbon into his glass, and said with a grin, "Look at that, even the polite little family knows how to smile through it." The words settled like smoke in the air, heavy and suffocating. I pushed myself up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. No one moved to help. My knees shook as I grabbed the edge of the table, steadying myself, blood dripping onto the tablecloth like scarlet blossoms. The only reaction from my parents was a quick glance at the stains, not at me. My mother tisked softly, muttering about ruined fabric, while my father reached for the salt shaker as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I pressed my hand against my cheek, feeling the swelling start to throb, and forced myself not to cry. Tears would only please him. Tears would only give them a reason to say I was weak. Instead, I let silence wrap itself around me like a cloak, swallowing my outrage and my shame, burying it deep in a place they could not touch. The meal went on. Plates clinked the fork against porcelain, the steady drone of the evening news on the muted television in the corner. I sat there bleeding, breathing through the dull ache, staring at the faces of the people who were supposed to be my refuge. My husband chewed loudly, grinning at his reflection in the darkened window. My father cleared his throat and asked about the weather tomorrow. My mother reminded him that the roses in her garden needed trimming. Their voices were calm, mundane, almost cheerful. It was like my pain was a ghost sitting beside me, invisible to everyone except myself. My husband raised his glass in a mock toast. To discipline, he said, smirking, "To keeping wives in line." My father chuckled again, a hollow sound that made my skin crawl. My mother kept her eyes down on her plate. I could feel my own heart hammering in my chest, each beat reminding me I was still here, still alive, still watching. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence between words, marking every second of my humiliation. I wanted to leave, but my body would not obey. It was not fear of him that rooted me in place. It was the crushing weight of realizing that even here in the house where I grew up, there was no safety, no arms to catch me. My parents smiled through it. That truth burned deeper than the cut on my cheek. I dabbed at the blood with the edge of my sleeve. My movements steady, deliberate, refusing to let my hands shake. My husband leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "You know they will never take your side," he whispered, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You are mine, and even they agree." He leaned back, smirk widening as he drained his glass. The liquid gurgled the ice, clinking the sound of his triumph. My eyes locked on the candle flickering in the center of the table. Its flame trembled small yet unbroken. I held on to that image because everything else in the room told me I was powerless. But I was not. Not truly. Not forever. In that moment, as blood dried against my skin and silence pressed against my chest, I promised myself one thing. This would not be the last time they saw me hurt, but it would be the last time they saw me silent. The dining room felt colder as the minutes dragged on, though the heater buzzed faintly against the wall and the smell of roasted meat still lingered in the air. My cheek pulsed with heat, the sting of broken glass settling into a dull throb. Yet my parents carried on as if the evening were nothing more than another family dinner. My mother rose from her seat to gather a few empty plates, her hand steady, though her eyes flicked only briefly to the blood smeared on my collar. She murmured something about dessert waiting in the fridge, her voice carefully measured, not alarmed, not compassionate, just bland like an automated message. My father cleared his throat, leaned back in his chair, and asked my husband if the new car he was considering still had the rebate deal at the dealership. My husband smirked, replying with exaggerated detail about horsepower and discounts, while I sat silent, pressing my sleeve against my face, feeling the tacky dryness of half-clotted blood. No one asked if I was all right. No one offered water, ice, or comfort. The silence in their avoidance screamed louder than any words. I remembered being a child in this same house, falling off a bike in the driveway and scraping my knee, my father telling me to get up and stop whining while my mother dabbed at the cut without looking me in the eye. It was the same script now, only the wound deeper, more humiliating. Their smiles earlier when the bottle broke had not been joy, not exactly, but something else, a grim satisfaction that I had chosen this man and now must endure him. I chewed the inside of my cheek, the metallic taste mixing with the bitterness rising in my throat. I wanted to slam my hands on the table and force them to look at me to admit what they saw, but I knew how that would end. They would call me dramatic. They would remind me that marriage is sacred and imperfect. They would imply I had provoked it. That knowledge stung worse than the cut. The television in this corner played an old sitcom rerun, canned laughter spilling into the room. It clashed grotesquely with the silence between us, a reminder that somewhere in the world people laughed for real, while in this room laughter was a mask to cover cruelty. My husband shifted in his chair, satisfied, reaching lazily for another drink, his belly rising and falling like a man at ease in his kingdom. My father nodded approvingly when he joked about how strong the liquor was, as if the blow he had just delivered to me were no more than a clumsy toast gone wrong. My mother returned with a pie, placing it carefully at the center of the table, slicing it with delicate precision, while her daughter's skin swelled purple inches away. She asked whether anyone wanted whipped cream. My lips parted, ready to ask how she could serve dessert, while her child bled, but the words froze. I realized she did not want an answer. She wanted continuity, the illusion that this was normal, that no boundaries had been crossed, and so I sat mute, the weight of their denial pressing against my ribs. The room was heavy with ordinary conversation talk of gardens, weather taxes. The blood on my blouse dried stiff. I felt invisible, reduced to a prop, a cautionary tale my parents would never tell out loud but silently endorse. Every scrape of a fork on porcelain was a reminder that I was not worth disrupting the evening for. I reached for a glass of water, my hand trembling slightly, and saw my father's gaze land on the motion. He frowned not at my pain, but at the shaking glass, as though weakness itself offended him. I steadied my hand, gripped tighter, swallowed carefully, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me falter. My husband chuckled again, a sound that grated, then leaned close enough for only me to hear. He whispered that I looked pathetic and that my parents clearly agreed. His words burrowed into the silence my family had built around me. I clenched my jaw and stared at the candle still flickering on the table, imagining that flame swallowing every lie they told themselves. I knew then that my silence was the glue holding their facade together, but it would not last forever. Not this time. I sat among them, my face throbbing, my heart pounding their words, filling the room like bland wallpaper, and I promised myself I would no longer be part of their performance. The bruise on my cheek was not the first, and as I sat there in that suffocating dining room, the memories unfolded like an old film reel flickering against the back of my eyes. The bottle tonight was louder, bloodier, but the pattern had been set long before. I remembered the first time his hand struck me. It was not with a bottle or even with a fist, but with the flat of his palm across my face after I asked if he could help wash the dishes. We were only 6 months into marriage, then the honeymoon glow barely faded, and I stood frozen in our small kitchen as the sting bloomed across my skin. He apologized quickly afterward, pulling me into his chest, whispering that he was stressed from work, and I always knew how to push his buttons. He kissed my forehead, promised it would never happen again, and I wanted so badly to believe him that I swallowed the pain whole. I did not tell anyone. The silence felt easier, but silence has a way of growing heavier with each incident. Months later, it was another slap quicker this time delivered when I interrupted him while he was watching a game. I stumbled against the coffee table, my lips splitting against the wood. He tossed me a napkin like I was an accident to be cleaned up. Again, he apologized softer than the blow, coaxing me with words about love and marriage, saying we all had our moments. I nodded numb, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I had talked too much. My parents visited that weekend. My lips still healing, I wore extra lipstick, hoping to cover the line, but my mother noticed. She frowned, asked what happened, and I lied without hesitation. I told her I slipped in the kitchen. Her face softened, but not with concern, with relief. She wanted to believe it was nothing, and so she did. My father barely looked up from his paper. From then on, it became easier for them to see nothing. Later, there was the night of the broken rib. We had argued about money, about how he drained our account for gambling apps while bills piled high. His face darkened, his hands clenched, and before I could move, he shoved me hard against the edge of the counter. The crack reverberated through me, sharp, breathtaking. I collapsed to the floor, gasping like a fish out of water. He hovered above me, panic flickering across his face for only a second before the mask of anger returned. He barked at me not to exaggerate, not to make him the villain. At the hospital, I told the doctor I had fallen down the stairs. My mother came to pick me up afterward, her mouth a thin line, her eyes darting everywhere but my bruised body. She did not ask, she did not want to know. Silence was her offering to the altar of appearances, and I accepted it, telling myself I could endure. Then there was the night he smashed my phone against the wall because I had not answered his call quickly enough. Shards of plastic littered the carpet like confetti from a party no one wanted to attend. He stood over me shouting that I was ungrateful, that he provided everything, that I would be nothing without him. I believed it for a time. Gaslighting does that. It wraps around your thoughts until his voice sounds like your own. Every insult echoed in my head as though carved into stone. You are worthless. You are mine. No one else will ever stand by you. Each repetition etched deeper grooves in my self-worth. Yet even then, some part of me resisted. I started keeping a journal, scribbling down dates, times, words he hurled at me. At first, it was only for myself to remind me that I was not imagining the abuse. When he told me I provoked him, I looked at the pages, the ink steady my handwriting, proof that it had happened. Still, I kept the notebook hidden like contraband. My parents visited one evening when the bruise behind my ear had not yet faded. My father noticed, I could tell by the way his eyes lingered, but he said nothing. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, humming the melody discordant against the thick silence. I wanted them to speak, to demand answers, but they never did. Instead, they praised my husband for his promotion, toasted his success, while I sat beside him aching. Each toast felt like a dagger twisting deeper, their complicity a wound that would not heal. And then came last winter. Snow piled high outside the house, quiet except for the hum of the heater. We argued again this time about children. I told him I wanted to wait to heal, to feel safe first. His rage exploded. He threw a mug across the room, porcelain shattering against the wall, and when I gasped, he grabbed my shoulders and shook me until my teeth rattled. He called me barren, useless, ungrateful. My parents dropped by unexpectedly the next day. The bruise on my arm was obvious, the purple blooming like ink under the skin. My mother glanced at it and quickly looked away, focusing on rearranging flowers on the table. My father complimented my husband's choice of wine. I understood then that I was truly alone in their eyes. They had chosen him, or rather, they had chosen silence, because silence meant no confrontation, no shame aired publicly. Their smiles were easier than truth. Now, sitting at the table with blood drying on my cheek from the bottle, I realized how long the pattern had been building. The slap in the kitchen, the rib against the counter, the mug shattered against the wall, all threads weaving into tonight's tapestry of violence. Every time they looked away, every time I bit back the truth, the cycle deepened. but patterns are not destiny. As I sat staring at the flickering candle, I felt the old journal hidden in the back of my closet like a heartbeat calling me forward. I would not let their silence define me anymore. The bruises were real, the memories vivid, and now the betrayal of my parents' smile seared into my mind. I promised myself I would no longer be complicit in my own erasure. This pattern would break, and the break would not be mine to bear. The morning after the dinner, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the bruise on my face swollen and angry, the cut at my temple jagged and dark. I pressed a damp cloth against it, wincing but refusing to cry. Behind me, the house was silent. My husband still snoring heavily on the couch, a half-empty bottle balanced on his chest. My phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a name I had not seen in months. Rachel. An old friend from high school, someone who once knew me before my life, was whittled down into silence. I hesitated before answering, but when her voice filled the line, I felt something crack inside me. She said she was nearby, that she wanted to see me, that she had been thinking about me for weeks. I told her not to, that it was not a good time, but she came anyway. The knock on the door startled me. My husband barely stirred. I slipped out of the bathroom, pulled a sweater tight around me to cover the bloodstains, and opened the door just enough to let her in. Rachel stepped inside. Her eyes, scanning my face, and the light in them shifted from casual greeting to sharp concern. She did not gasp, did not pity, just studied me with a calm intensity that made me feel both exposed and seen. "What happened?" she asked softly, though I could tell she already knew. I tried to lie. Said I fell, said it was nothing, but she shook her head firmly. "No more lies, Claire. Not to me." Her voice was steady, not accusing, just resolute. My throat tightened, and I could not hold it anymore. I nodded once barely, but it was enough. She exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for years. "Then listen," she whispered. "I know what he is doing to you. I know because I have seen it before, and I know you cannot fight it alone." She pulled a small folder from her bag and laid it on the kitchen table right next to the empty beer bottles. Inside were printouts, pamphlets, contact numbers. She had prepared. She slid one toward me, a hotline number, then another page showing how to document injuries, how to preserve texts, how to back up photos to a hidden cloud account. I stared at her stunned that someone outside the walls of my life had been preparing for my escape. Why, I asked, "Why are you doing this?" "Because no one else will," she said simply. "Your parents will not. They have made their choice. But I choose to see you." The words pierced deeper than any wound because they reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten that I mattered. She leaned closer. "You need proof, Claire. You need to build a record. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Every bruise, every word, every stolen dollar, write it down, photograph it, record it. It is not paranoia, it is protection." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The thought of keeping evidence terrified me, but the idea of doing nothing terrified me more. Rachel reached into her bag again and produced a small voice recorder no larger than a lipstick tube. "Fresh batteries," she said. "Keep it nearby. He will not know." I ran my fingers over it, the cool plastic foreign and yet oddly comforting. She was giving me a weapon not of violence but of truth. I thought of the journal hidden in my closet, the scribbled notes I had kept in secret. This was the next step. Rachel touched my hand, lightly steadying me. "You are not crazy," she said. That was the first time anyone had spoken those words to me. My chest ached with the weight of all the years I had doubted myself. My husband stirred in the living room, shifting, mumbling, but still asleep. Rachel lowered her voice. "You do not have to decide everything tonight. Just start. Document. Protect yourself." Her eyes met mine again, unwavering. "And when you are ready, I will be here." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control return, faint like the flame of the candle last night, but undeniable. The silence that had smothered me now had a crack, a thin line of light seeping through. Rachel gathered her bag, straightened, and looked at me once more. "Promise me you will not bury this again. Promise me you will see yourself the way I see you." I nodded, my voice hoarse, but I said the words. "I promise." She gave the smallest smile, then slipped out the door, leaving me alone in the kitchen, the folder and recorder in front of me, the echo of her presence lingering like oxygen in my lungs. I looked at the evidence of her care, then at the bruised reflection in the window, and I knew something had shifted. I was not alone anymore. That night, after Rachel left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the folder she had placed before me. The pages inside whispered possibility, but also danger, because if he ever discovered them, he would not hesitate to destroy both the papers and me. Still, I opened it, running my fingers across the hotline numbers and the instructions about documenting abuse. I felt the same nervous anticipation as a child about to step onto a stage, my body taut with fear, yet propelled by something deeper, the need to reclaim myself. I rose quietly, slipped into the bedroom where my husband lay snoring, and retrieved my journal from the closet. The worn notebook with its dog-eared corners had been my silent confidant, each page marked with dates, insults, and bruises. Tonight, it became more than memory. It became evidence. I placed it beside the folder, then fetched my phone. I scrolled back through months of text messages, each cruel word hidden between casual lines. I screenshotted everything, uploading them into a hidden cloud account under a decoy name, just as Rachel had taught me. The glow of the screen lit my swollen cheek, the quiet clicks of capture sounding like small victories. My pulse raced, but I felt steadier with each saved image. At dawn, I crept into the bathroom, locking the door, lifting my shirt to reveal purple bruises across my ribs from weeks earlier that had not yet faded. I took photographs holding the phone steady, though my hands trembled. I whispered to myself, "This is real. You are not imagining it." The words echoed against the tiles, affirming my reality. Each click was proof that I was not insane, not the hysterical wife he accused me of being. Later, I ventured into the living room where empty bottles cluttered the floor. I slipped the recorder into my pocket and pressed the button, heart pounding as the red light blinked. He stirred muttered curses at the sunlight seeping through the blinds, then began rambling about how useless I was, how I should clean faster, how nothing I did mattered. The words etched themselves onto the recorder's memory. His voice no longer just air, but evidence. When he threw a cushion across the room and shouted that no one would ever believe me, I nearly smiled because now someone would. Each insult, each slur became a weapon in my arsenal. Days turned into a rhythm of secrecy. When he slammed doors, I wrote it down. When he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave red marks, I photographed it discreetly before the skin faded back to pale. I stashed copies of files in a hidden drive labeled with mundane names so he would never look. I recorded his drunken rants, his sneering laughter, his phone calls to friends bragging about keeping me in line. Each recording filled the silence that had once crushed me with a new weight, the weight of preparation. I began to notice patterns more clearly, how he always struck when he had been drinking heavily, how he apologized with the same words, how he blamed me with the same rehearsed lines. Recognizing the script dulled its power, and writing it down broke the cycle of doubt. Still, there were moments of terror. One evening, he found me in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, and for a split second, I thought he had caught me. My throat seized, but he only demanded another drink before staggering back to the couch. I exhaled slowly, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Another time, he questioned why I was spending longer in the bathroom. I lied about stomach pain, and he scoffed, uninterested. The close calls fueled my resolve. I contacted Rachel, secretly sending her small batches of files from a library computer where I knew he would not trace me. She organized them, creating a timeline with notes, signatures, and backups. She was methodical, calm, and I leaned on her strength like a rope guiding me through fog. In those quiet library corners, away from his watchful eyes, I allowed myself to breathe freely for the first time in years. I remembered the advice printed on one of Rachel's sheets. Prepare as if no one will believe you. That sentence seared into me. It was the truth of every battered woman's fight. The need to be more meticulous than the abuser, to be colder and sharper than the system that often dismissed us. I collected medical bills, bank statements showing his withdrawals receipts from nights he claimed to be working late, but was really gambling. I tucked them into manila envelopes, labeling each carefully. Each step was a brick laid in the foundation of my escape. I also prepared myself mentally. I practiced standing before the mirror, holding my gaze, repeating truths I had almost lost. I matter. I am real. I will not be erased. My reflection still bore bruises, my skin still mapped with violence, but my eyes began to steady. The trembling lessened. The candle at night became my ritual of flame. I lit not for him, not for my parents, but for myself to remind me of endurance and fire. Even when he mocked me for wasting matches, I did not stop. It was my secret rebellion, my quiet preparation. One night, Rachel called her voice low. "You are building something powerful," she said. "He will never see it coming." I closed my eyes, gripping the recorder in my palm, and whispered back, "Then I will finally breathe." Preparation was no longer just about survival, it was about reclaiming the narrative. For years, he had told the story of me weak, hysterical dependent. Now I was writing my own story in ink, photos, files, and recordings. Each artifact a testament that I existed, that I endured, that I resisted. And when the day came, I would place them before the world like a mirror he could not shatter. That thought steadied me when fear clawed at my chest. Even when my parents visited again and looked at me with those same evasive eyes, even when my father praised my husband's charm, even when my mother avoided mentioning the bruise that spread down my neck, I held my silence not as submission, but as strategy. Because soon, silence would no longer be my prison. It would be his undoing. The night it happened, the house smelled of stale beer and sweat, and the faint metallic tang of old blood still clung to the tablecloth from that dinner no one mentioned again. He had fallen asleep on the recliner, his mouth open, snores rattling like thunder through the room. I moved quietly, my bare feet soundless against the carpet, my heart steady in a way it had not been for years. The manila envelope sat ready in the drawer where I had hidden it thick with photographs, recordings, and documents. Rachel had warned me there would be no perfect moment, only a window, and tonight the window opened. I placed the envelope carefully on the table beside his half-empty glass. The paper looked ordinary, but I knew it carried the weight of my life. The candle flickered on the counter as if holding its breath with me. When the knock came at the door, he stirred, grunted, then rolled over, still half asleep. I opened the door to Rachel, who stepped in briskly, her eyes scanning the room, her phone already in her hand. Behind her, 2 officers entered their uniforms sharp against the sagging furniture of my living room. My husband blinked awake, confusion crossing his face. Then, anger rising quickly like a storm. "What the hell is this?" he barked, pushing himself upright, his voice thick with drink. I stood still, spine straight, refusing to look away. "This is the truth," I said quietly, gesturing toward the envelope. He sneered, reaching for it, tearing the flap open with clumsy fingers. His eyes flicked over the photographs of bruises, the screenshots of messages, the bank withdrawals. For a moment, his smirk faltered, then returned sharper, desperate. "This is all lies," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She made this up. She's paranoid, unstable. My parents can tell you she exaggerates." He looked around for allies who were not there. Rachel lifted her phone higher, recording her calm presence slicing through his noise. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable but attentive. My husband's voice grew louder, more frantic. "This is entrapment! She is staging this! You cannot believe a word she says!" He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the glass. I did not flinch. Instead, I pressed the button on the small recorder Rachel had given me, the one I had filled with his drunken confessions. His own voice filled the room, harsh, unmistakable. "You are worthless. You are nothing. No one will ever believe you." The sound silenced him more effectively than any shout could. His face drained of color as the officers leaned closer to listen. Rachel's recording caught every flicker of panic across his features. He lunged toward me, then his hand shooting out to grab my arm. But Rachel's voice cut through steady and cold. "Let her go. This is live." He froze his grip, loosening as if the phone in her hand burned him. He stumbled back, eyes darting the arrogance leaking away to reveal fear. I stepped forward, my shoulders square, my voice calm. "Smile," I told him. "You are finally on camera." His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence was louder than his rage, his power slipping through his fingers. One of the officers reached for the envelope, flipping through the pages, nodding slowly as he examined the medical records, the notarized notes, the timeline Rachel had meticulously assembled. The other officer looked directly at me. "You documented all this yourself?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, my voice level, "because no one else would." My husband's laugh came then brittle hollow. "She is trying to ruin me," he insisted, pacing like a caged animal. "She is obsessed, unstable, vindictive." He jabbed a finger at me. "She has been spying on me, hacking my accounts." I tilted my head slightly. "Good," I said, "because now they see who you are." He lunged for the envelope again, but the officer blocked him, ordering him to sit down. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot do this to me," he shouted. "I am the one who takes care of everything. She is nothing without me." But the evidence in the officer's hands told a different story. The recording still played faintly in the background, his voice condemning him with every cruel word. Rachel stepped closer, steadying me with her presence, her phone capturing the moment his arrogance collapsed. He dropped into the chair, his head in his hands, muttering curses. For once, he was the one being watched, scrutinized, documented. The tables had turned. I took a deep breath, the first full breath in years, and let it fill me with calm. I looked at him not with fear, but with clarity. "You always told me no one would believe me," I said evenly. "Now everyone does." He lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, his lips trembling between rage and despair. Then his knees buckled as he tried to rise, his body shaking, and he sank down again. Lower this time, his posture broken, his pride shattered. The sight was not triumphant, but necessary. The image of a man stripped of the control he had wielded like a weapon. The officers moved forward, instructing him to remain seated, their voices firm. Rachel lowered her phone slightly, but I could still feel the camera's invisible gaze marking this as the moment the silence ended. My husband whispered something then barely audible, a plea wrapped in bitterness. "Do not do this, Claire. We can fix it." I met his eyes, my voice steady as stone. "You broke it. And now, it is finished." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting each second of his unraveling. The public showdown had begun, and for the first time it was not me on trial, but him. At the police station, the air felt heavy with disinfectant and stale coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above me. I sat at a metal table, the envelope of evidence spread open, the officers leafing through each page while I held my breath. My husband sat across the hall in another room, his voice muffled but sharp, insisting to anyone who would listen that I was hysterical, manipulative, unstable. He demanded they call my parents confident they would back him. I knew he was right about that part. My parents had always sided with him, praising his discipline and control, while dismissing my bruises as clumsiness or exaggeration. The thought made my stomach tighten, but Rachel was beside me, her presence like a steadying hand on my shoulder even when she said nothing. The officer asked me to recount everything from the beginning, not just last night, but years back. My throat was raw, but I spoke steady, detailing the first time he shoved me, the first time he cut off my access to money, the first time my parents said I was lucky to have him. Each memory felt like reopening an old wound, but as the words left me, they became something else. Testimony, evidence, a record that could not be erased. The officer scribbled notes, occasionally glancing up, his eyes softening in places where I faltered. Then came the call from my parents. The officer placed the phone on speaker, their voices filling the sterile room. My mother's tone was brisk, dismissive. "Officer," she said, "Claire has always been dramatic. She bruises easily. She invents stories when she feels neglected." My father chimed in his voice, firm, authoritative. "She should be at home with her husband, not dragging our family name through the mud. You people are being manipulated." The officer's pen stilled on the page. Rachel leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. "With all due respect, sir, we have photographs, recordings, medical reports. This is not drama. This is abuse." My parents ignored her, their words a steady rhythm of denial, blaming me, exonerating him. The officer finally interrupted, his tone clipped. "Thank you for your input, but we will evaluate the evidence ourselves." He ended the call, leaving their words echoing in the room like a poison I had inhaled my whole life. For a moment, shame threatened to crush me. But then I realized something important. For the first time, someone outside my family had refused to take their side. The officer turned to me, his expression professional but not unkind. "This will not be simple," he warned. "He has connections and your parents are willing to testify for him. It will be a battle." I nodded, feeling the weight of it but no longer shrinking. Battles could be fought. Silence could not. They moved me into another room where I could see him through a pane of glass. He was pacing, hands waving, his face red, his charm turned up high as he spoke to a higher-ranking detective who had just arrived. I watched as he leaned in, gesturing the same charm he once used to woo me, now deployed like a shield. The detective's expression stayed neutral. Then the officer slid my recorder across the table and pressed play. My husband's voice filled the hallway, venomous and unmistakable. "You are worthless. You are nothing. No one will ever believe you." The detective froze, then slowly looked back at him. My husband's mouth kept moving, but the sound was drowned out by his own recorded cruelty. It was the first time I had seen his confidence falter in front of someone outside the family. The detective nodded once and walked out of the room, his eyes meeting mine briefly before he closed the door. Rachel whispered beside me, "You see, Claire, the truth is louder than their denial." But the struggle did not end there. They asked me about finances, about property, about my willingness to testify. Each question was a new weight, but I carried it one by one because this time I was not burying the truth. Hours passed, the institutional machinery grinding slowly. My husband's lawyer arrived slick and sharp, already threatening lawsuits, calling me vindictive. He spoke of my parents' testimony as though it were ironclad proof that I was the liar. The officers kept their composure, reminding him the evidence spoke louder than character statements. Yet I felt the strain, the old fear whispering that the system might still fail me, that my parents' voices would still matter more than my pain. Rachel touched my hand again, grounding me. She leaned close and whispered, "Even if it drags on, you have already won something tonight. He is no longer untouchable." The words sank in, steadying me like an anchor. I realized then that the institutional struggle was not just about convincing strangers in uniforms. It was about convincing myself that I was worthy of being heard, that my story mattered, even if my parents refused to see it. The detective returned at last, his expression serious but resolute. "We will file charges," he said. "He will not be going home tonight." My husband's shouts echoed down the hall, furious, disbelieving, his voice cracking on words he once wielded like weapons. For once, the system had placed a barrier between us, fragile but real. I exhaled long and trembling, as if I had been holding my breath for years. Rachel squeezed my hand, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that survival was not just possible, but inevitable. The struggle had only begun, but so had my freedom. The next morning, I woke in Rachel's guest room, sunlight leaking through the blinds, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind restless. I had not slept properly in weeks, maybe months, yet that night I closed my eyes, knowing he was behind bars, if only temporarily. Still, the question gnawed at me. Would the system protect me long enough, or would his connections and my parents' testimony bury me again? Rachel handed me coffee, her voice calm but sharp with purpose. "Claire," she said, "we are not stopping here. Evidence hidden in files only convinces officers, but exposure convinces everyone." She showed me her phone. She had uploaded a short clip of the confrontation in my living room, carefully edited to protect my privacy, but undeniable in its impact. His voice was clear, venomous, telling me I was worthless, telling me no one would believe me. Within hours, it had spread hundreds of shares, comments flooding in from strangers who did not dismiss me as dramatic strangers who recognized the patterns of abuse etched in his tone. My hands trembled as I scrolled, reading words like, "I believe you and I lived this too, and you are not alone." For years, my voice had been swallowed in the silence of my family's denial, but now strangers across the country gave it back to me. Meanwhile, the local news had already caught wind. A domestic abuse case involving a respected businessman with glowing family support was irresistible. Cameras appeared outside the station, reporters asking questions. At first, the police refused to confirm details, but once the clip circulated, they could not contain it. His name leaked, his reputation trembled. That afternoon, they moved him to court for a preliminary hearing. I sat in the gallery, Rachel beside me, while he stood before the judge in a crisp suit, trying to mask the swelling anger in his jaw. His lawyer spoke smoothly about misunderstandings, exaggerated claims, a wife with fragile emotions. Then, Rachel rose when the judge allowed a victim statement. Her voice was calm, commanding. She described what she had witnessed, the bruises she had photographed, the years she had known me shrinking under his control. She handed over the recordings, the documents, the photographs. The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed. The lawyer objected, claiming bias, but the evidence was too stark to ignore. Then came the moment that turned the room. The video clip Rachel had uploaded appeared on the screen. My husband's voice filled the courtroom, booming, undeniable. "You are worthless. You are nothing. No one will ever believe you." A ripple went through the room, gasps from strangers' eyes narrowing on him. For once, it was not my parents' word against mine. It was his own word against himself. His face drained of color, his hands clenched at his sides. The lawyer whispered urgently, but he could not unsay what the world had now heard. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens capturing the downfall of a man who had always believed his cruelty would remain private. When the session ended and he was escorted out, cameras flashed microphones shoved forward. He kept his head down, but the image of him shrinking under the public eye was burned into me. That evening, the story aired on local news, then national outlets picked it up. The narrative was no longer a wife crying alone, but a woman who had documented every bruise, every insult, and brought them into the light. My parents tried to push back. They gave an interview claiming I was fabricating, seeking attention. But the backlash was immediate. Viewers flooded comment sections calling them enablers, blind, complicit. Their polished denial crumbled under the weight of strangers demanding accountability. For the first time in my life, my parents were not the unquestioned authority. They were just people exposed for their silence. That night, I sat with Rachel on her couch, the television replaying clips of reporters outside the courthouse, his name now spoken with disgust. She looked at me and said softly, "This is not just your fight anymore. It belongs to everyone who sees themselves in your story." I felt tears slide down my face, not of fear, but of release. For years, I had begged for one person to believe me, and now thousands of strangers did. But the twist of public exposure was not only about me. It was about him. The man who once controlled every narrative, who charmed my parents and neighbors into dismissing me, now found himself unable to hide. Every cruel word he had uttered in private now echoed in public. He had no script for this stage. By the following day, his business associates distanced themselves statements released about values and integrity. His name was scrubbed from company websites. Sponsors pulled out of events he once chaired. He was no longer the man with power. He was the man with evidence stacked against him. My parents called again, furious, their voices brittle with desperation. "How could you shame us like this?" my mother hissed. "You have humiliated the family." I listened calm, then said quietly, "You did that when you chose him over me." I ended the call before her silence could reach me again. That evening, Rachel and I walked through the grocery store, my hood pulled up, her hand steady on my arm. A woman stopped us near the produce section, her eyes soft but determined. "Are you Claire?" she asked. When I nodded, she touched my hand gently. "I saw your video. I lived the same thing. Thank you for speaking." My throat tightened, but I managed to whisper, "Thank you for listening." More strangers approached over the next days, some in person, many online. Each echoing the same truth. His silence had protected him, but my voice had freed me. The twist was clear. He had always told me no one would believe me. Now the entire world did, and it was him who no one believed anymore. The trial dragged on for weeks, each session pulling at old wounds, but also stitching new layers of strength into me. My husband's lawyer fought hard, trying to dismiss recordings, discredit Rachel, and lean heavily on my parents' testimony. My parents sat tall in court, their faces firm, their voices steady as they claimed I was unstable, that I had exaggerated every bruise, every word. But each time they spoke, the evidence countered them. Photos projected on large screens, medical records signed by doctors, financial documents showing control over every dollar I earned. And then the recording of him screaming filled the courtroom once more. No cross-examination could erase the venom dripping from his voice. The judge watched closely, unimpressed by my parents' polished denials. The moment that sealed it came when the prosecution revealed text messages Rachel had pulled from an old shared phone bill lines where he mocked me to friends, bragging about keeping me in line, about how my parents always covered for him. The jury's faces hardened. My parents shifted in their seats, suddenly less confident. When the verdict came guilty on multiple counts of assault and coercive control, the courtroom was silent except for his outburst. He shouted that I had ruined him, that my parents would never forgive me, that I was nothing without him. But his words no longer carried power. Bailiffs restrained him, his voice echoing hollow in the room. The judge sentenced him to years in prison, not just for the violence, but for the pattern of abuse documented so meticulously. As he was led away, he turned to look at me, eyes wide with disbelief, as if the world had betrayed him. For the first time, I did not look away. The aftermath spread quickly. His business collapsed within days, partners severing ties, employees quitting rather than be associated with his name. News outlets ran follow-up stories highlighting not only his abuse, but the role of enablers my parents included. Their interviews resurfaced online clips of them denying my pain, played side by side with evidence of his guilt. Strangers condemned them as complicit, neighbors avoided them, their polished image shattered. I heard from relatives who had long suspected something but had been too afraid to speak against the family narrative. Now they reached out with tentative apologies, some offering support, others simply acknowledging the truth. My parents refused to face me directly. They sent letters at first filled with anger, accusing me of betrayal, warning that I had destroyed our family's reputation. But the letters grew shorter, more desperate until they stopped altogether. Their silence this time was not oppressive, but freeing. Rachel stood by me through it all, helping me file paperwork, find counseling, and rebuild the pieces of my independence. I moved into a small apartment, modest, but mine, every item inside chosen by me, not dictated by someone else's control. At night, I lay in bed and listened to the quiet, a quiet that once terrified me, but now felt like peace. The community support grew, too. Survivors reached out through social media, sharing their own stories, thanking me for speaking. I realized my fight had become bigger than my marriage, bigger than my parents' denial. It had become part of a collective voice, one that said silence was no longer acceptable. The consequences for him were legal and public. The consequences for my parents were social and moral. For me, the aftermath was healing, not quick, not simple, but real. I carried scars, physical and emotional, but they no longer defined me as broken. They marked me as someone who endured and resisted. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the woman who begged to be believed. I saw a woman who made the truth louder than their lies. In the weeks after the sentencing, life slowed into something unfamiliar but precious. There were no footsteps to fear at night, no sudden crashes of objects thrown in anger, no sharp words slicing into my skin as cruelly as any strike. Instead, there was quiet. At first, the quiet felt foreign, almost hollow, but with time it became a comfort. I woke in the mornings and brewed coffee simply because I wanted to, not because I was anticipating someone else's demand. I walked to the park, breathing in the crisp air, feeling my body move without the weight of fear on my shoulders. Rachel often joined me, her presence steady but never intrusive, letting me reclaim space at my own pace. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench with sunlight filtering through the trees, she asked me how it felt to finally be free. The word free caught in my chest. I had lived so long under control that I had forgotten what freedom meant. Slowly, I realized freedom was not only about him being gone, it was about no longer carrying my parents' silence as a chain around my neck. Their voices, once the authority of my life, now echoed only faintly in the distance, powerless against the truth that had already been spoken. Letters from strangers continued to arrive, stories from women and men across the country who had endured similar abuse. Each letter reminded me that what had nearly destroyed me could instead become part of someone else's survival. I kept those letters in a box, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of connection. For the first time, I felt part of something larger than myself. Healing was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of small victories. Signing my own lease, smiling at my reflection, cooking a meal without fear of criticism, calling Rachel not to ask for rescue, but simply to share joy. Each step built a life that belonged entirely to me. The scars on my skin faded, but the memory of them lingered. Instead of shame, I chose to carry them as evidence of what I had endured and overcome. One evening, I lit a single candle in my apartment, not as a ritual, but as a quiet celebration. I sat in the glow and whispered to myself, "You survived. You fought back. You won." The words were not shouted in a courtroom or broadcast on television. They were spoken softly, just for me, and that was enough. In that moment, I understood that empowerment did not always look like grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it was the stillness of sitting in your own space, breathing freely, knowing no one could take that from you again. My story had begun with silence stretched through violence and denial erupted in public exposure. And now it ended here, in peace. The quiet was not empty. It was full of my own voice, finally steady, finally mine.